How should we speak about God? Today, as we find ourselves in a climate of conceptual and moral chaos, we have debates about whether or not God exists. The question in the pre-modern world had never been whether God exists or not. That was not a serious question. The question pertained to the nature of God. What is meant by God? Now, that question has been obscured by and large in our age. There are reasons for this, but we don't need to tackle them now. The aim of the present note, the present oral note, is to illuminate the problem of ways of speaking of God. So we have this huge question mark, God. What is its content? What are we speaking about? And to the extent that we face that problem of the content of that term, we begin to see what the best way of speaking of God is. Perhaps there is a true way of speaking of God that is linked to the true God. So that allows us to speak of the true God. In other words, the God that is spoken of truly. So if there is a true God, there should be a true way of speaking of God. And the two questions are inseparable for us. But now, it is helpful to tell a story. And we begin with the dawn of Christianity, the Gospels. The Gospels, when read carefully, stand as we could say, Jewish defense of the Jewish faith. But what does that really mean? We can say with reason, with good reason, that the Gospels are written in defense of the living God of Abraham, which is to say, really, of the ultimate legitimacy of the faithful life of Hebrew fathers. But now, we could say that Hellenic Jews, who were well versed both in the Hebrew Bible and in Greek, and so the language of the philosophers, expose Jerusalem to Athens or to philosophy. And this in order to illuminate the ultimate legitimacy of the Hebrew tradition or the life of the Hebrew people as a nation. This defense that we find in the Gospels yields in fact, takes the form of formulations that may strike us as, might have struck older people, in fact, both Jews of old and philosophers, as ambiguous, to say the least. But these very formulations open the door to what will called medieval rationalism. With medieval rationalism that unfolds to a great extent out of the Gospels, God is, of course, the God of Abraham, but he is especially being. So we could say, a philosophical formulation of the God of Abraham. And by the same token, the mysterious future of Moses' God, where in Hebrew essentially he presents himself as the one who is to be mysteriously. I am the one, or I shall be the one, what I shall be. In other words, absolute transcendence is, in fact, a present mysteriously open to eternity. So there is a kind of overlap of presence and the present and eternity. And this is what the parousia in Greek is all about. Now, from this we begin having an explicit tension between the language of, we could say, vulgar believers. So, for instance, we could see this in doubting Thomas, right, who needs to see in order to believe, and that of theologians who do not need to see in order to believe. In other words, they follow up on the Gospels, which teach us that we are to believe in things unseen, and this is ultimately what faith is about. Trusting not what is seen, or not basing our faith in what is seen, but rather in what is unseen. Now, this is crucial to understanding Christianity, of course, as St. Paul shows. However, of course, in the modern world, we have come to, well, if not, we at the very least underestimate the importance of this point, and in fact forget the full valence, the full import of that message, especially when we refer to notions such as the historical Jesus, and as we seek to confirm our faith with tangible evidence. So we have this tension in the Middle Ages, and you say, well, how is this tension managed? And there is, in fact, a third position, we could say, that manages these two poles. The God of, we could say, vulgar believers, the doubting Thomas, and the God of those who are to be blessed. For indeed, in the Gospel of John, according to John, we are told that, in fact, the character Jesus states that only those who will believe, not on the basis of what they see, shall be blessed. So, how do we mediate? And is there someone who mediates this God and the God of those who are to be blessed? So ultimately, the God of those who have true belief. And the answer to that is, the mystics. So we have mysticism, medieval mysticism, which essentially is a poetic philosophy that brings together in its formulations, in its ways of speaking, the God of vulgar believers and that of true believers. And so the mystics, for one, help the theologians, the philosophers, we could say the abstract philosophers, address this objection that they are merely engaging with abstract being. So an abstract God, a conceptual, even apparatus. And yet the mystics further highlight the inadequacy of the God of the vulgar as an imaginary person. So as the content of the imagination, in fact. There is a need felt for bridging the gap between the two. And that bridging is what dialogue, Christian dialogue, is all about. So we have appeals to a Christian community of faith, which is a community of dialogue open to the God of nature in one formulation, the form of the universe, so the mind even of the universe, the creator of heaven and earth and so forth. So it is through and in dialogue that these two poles are bridged. And the dialogue is, well, essentially mystical. Now, dialogue, Christian dialogue, invites us to heed the problem of form. This is an ancient problem. Plato refers to God as the form of the good. So everything that is good for us has a form. So the essence, that which the good is in itself, is the form, the boundary, the limit of what we hold as good. What we desire is what is good. So the boundary of our desire is ultimately, the ultimate boundary of our desire is God. The infinite boundary of our desire is God. Even though as boundary, this God is necessarily finite in some respect, as Aristotle indicates. Now, this problem of form suggests that all boundaries presuppose an ultimate boundary. This ultimate boundary would have to be the boundary of, or as well, of our consciousness and therefore also of our experience. Now, if that is the case, since our consciousness and experience are fluctuating, and we do not all have the same type of experience, the same type of conscious horizon or horizon of consciousness, inevitably we will have distinct, diverse conceptions of God, of that boundary. And so, for instance, brutes will perceive a lightning bolt as God. We could hear the sound of lightning, Zeus, onomatopoeia, whence Zeus, whence Deus, whence the Latin formulation of the Romantic languages have pick up on the Latin Deus, and so you have, for instance, Dio in Italian, Dieu in French, and so forth. God being the Germanic equivalent, Gott. the lightning bolt is limiting the passions, the experience, the consciousness is the boundary of the consciousness of brutes. They're scared. But for souls that we could call purged and so polite and educated, cleansed of the passions, the form of consciousness, of their experience, is perceived as an invisible form, we could say even an invisible form of pure understanding, of pure intellection. And yet with Christianity, God is said to enter into the flesh. Now, what is the significance of this proposition? God is inherent in the earthly, which is to say in fallen nature. So prior to appearing as the God of the philosophers, God is inherent in the life of pagans. So that the God of theologians / philosophers is at once the one that limits barbarism even prior to the formal rise of Christianity. The Father, by the same token, the Father in heaven is at once the Father on earth. In both cases, God is law. But now, whose law? Well, so it is in some respect, it is a variable law. It is law in itself, but it is variable, for indeed it is a law for the brutes and a law for, we could say, even the blessed. So it is the limit form of philosophical reasoning and of a non-philosophical imagination, or rather, to be more precise, a pre-philosophical imagination. So it is the God both of reason and the imagination. God then would be a form that reconciles the two. Now, if we have a form that reconciles the two, reason and imagination, what we would have is a convergence of form and content. To be more precise, we would need to have a perfection of reason. So reason as form or limit of the imagination would find its perfection in God as perfect intellect. And this is, by and large, the canonical position of medieval scholars. So God is undefiled mind of the universe. So the perfection of philosophy, essentially. So now with theology, we have this message that God is form, that this form is not merely external, but internal to the imagination. It is indeed the internal motor of the imagination, or of the production of images. The imagination receives images, not merely from without, but from within, or we could say from the ground up. There is still no notion of an active imagination, which is an invention of modernity's romanticism, that is to replace the medieval active intellect, which is divine. So the imagination is inadequate on its own, and reason, philosophical reason, is incomplete on its own. And so the two are perfected in God as an act, an agency. It's a first and perfect agency that is at work not only in an abstract reasoning, but already at the heart of the imagination, of all imagination, or in the production of all forms or images. What does this divine agency achieve then? Well, it brings all forms to full circle in God. This is a standard position again throughout the Middle Ages. So how does God bring all forms to full circle? Well, it enters, God as agency, enters into the dark, we are told. The most important, perhaps, formulation of this is found in John, the Gospel according to John. So the light enters in the dark to raise forms or order out of it. The forms of the vulgar imagination are then, or thereupon, purged gradually into those of the philosophers. However, that is not the end of the story, because these forms in turn, the forms that we could say of natural philosophy, are in turn sought back at the heart of the vulgar imagination in terms of its first mover. So God is reconciling the philosophers and the non-philosophers in this way, providentially. This would suggest that we can speak this way through this kind of account by going over this tension between the philosopher and the non-philosopher, and thus by engaging in dialogue between these two poles, between, to speak in pedestrian terms, between reason and the imagination. We can speak in these terms and say that there is a true God, and that this true God is the reconciler of these two poles. And this true God is neither a body, so content of the imagination, of the vulgar imagination, nor a physical, an abstraction from the physical. We could say that even the physical is an abstraction from God. Of course, it's some fallen derivation. So neither a physical abstraction nor a conceptual one, such as an abstract mind that we can contemplate purely aside from our daily lives. So this is the mirage of the philosophers, of course, the philosophers of nature. They can contemplate the mind of the universe without being bothered by the passions, without being concerned with vulgar political, ethical questions. The alternative, therefore, that is left is that the true God is the providential agency that gathers, that is gathering our life into itself, into this very agency. So here we have it. Is there a true God? Is there a true way of speaking of God? If there is a true way of speaking of God, then that way must somehow bridge these two poles of human life, and human experience, human consciousness, yes, is entailed by that. If there is a true God, that is the God that is addressed where we speak truly of God.